from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
Congress braces for the cliff. Welcome to the Monday edition as lawmakers return to Washington with all of 5 working days to keep Obamacare premiums from rising at the end of the year. And we're going to get the latest straight ahead. A report live from Capitol Hill from Bloomberg's Erik Wassen with insights this hour from Republican Congressman Troy Downing of Montana. And as President Zelenskiy gives ground on joining NATO, we're going to look more closely at peace talks in their second day in Berlin when we join Heather Conley from the American Enterprise Institute. Insights as well from our political panel, and it's all after a look at Wall Street. Let's get to the Monday trade first with Charlie Pellet at World Headquarters in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Mathieu. We've got a jobs report coming up tomorrow morning. Right now, we've got stocks trading lower ahead of that key piece of data with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ. They're all in the red. S&P right now down 13. That is a drop of just about 0.2%. The Dow lower by 104 points. Dow Industrials down 0.2%. NASDAQ is down 109. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 0.5%. The Bloomberg Mag 7 Index up now by 0.2%. The 10-year ahead of the employment data tomorrow morning, 4.17%, with the 2-year currently yielding 3.50%. Gold up $4 the ounce, 43.04 now, up 0.1%. Silver up 2.5%, 63.48 on silver, while West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.4%, 56.61 on WTI, and a retreat for Bitcoin down 3.2%, 85,000 now, 660 on Bitcoin. Confidence among American home builders edged up in December as builders continued to deploy sales incentives to motivate buyers. Among home building names today, we're looking at KB Home, trading down by 0.8%. Toll Brothers, the luxury home builder, up 0.9%, and Lennar lower now by 0.1%. Again, recapping, stocks lower, S&P 500 index down 0.2%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here is Joe Mathieu.
All right, Charlie, thank you. Live from New York, Charlie Pellet will have more on the markets coming up in about 20 minutes' time here on Balance of Power as we connect the dots between Washington and Wall Street together once again. Thank you for joining us here on the Monday edition on Bloomberg TV and radio, with a very short schedule left on Capitol Hill. And that's where we're going to start our conversation as we prepare to look abroad here on peace talks involving Ukraine as well. We'll do that with Heather Conley in just a moment. She's with us in studio today from the American Enterprise Institute. Only 5 working days left this year, though, if you're a member of Congress. And of course, there's something that's being called a cliff at the end of this month. That's when enhanced Obamacare subsidies put in place during COVID are set to expire. The very matter that led to the longest shutdown in government history has still not been resolved. They are set to expire at the end of this month. And if you talk to anybody who knows what's happening in Washington, they will tell you we're going over the cliff. That will not, however, stop lawmakers from taking a couple of swings at the ball. There will be voting this week. More realistic voting when it comes to the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. It's passed the House already, and all 3,000 pages are set to pass the Senate at some point this week. Senate will also clear a package of about 100 nominees and might do some individual voting on some of the other nominations coming from the Trump White House. It's what's happening in the House of Representatives that's going to be interesting here, because remember, Speaker Johnson promised to vote on a Republican health care package. It emerged on Friday night as we were all heading home for a very chilly weekend. There may also be a separate vote on a bipartisan plan that would help to extend the Obamacare subsidies. Speaker Johnson speaking about this at the end of last week. Listen.
When the Democrats talk about health care affordability, okay, this catchphrase that they have, they are talking about one thing and one thing only. They are talking about continuing handouts to big insurance companies. They have no ideas, they have no desire to fix the broken system they created. They just want to subsidize it. And subsidy is a big word. It means they're taking taxpayer dollars and funding a broken system.
I guess subsidy is a big word, even here at Bloomberg. At least the weight that it carries. Ask Erik Wassen. He's been covering this on the daily since before the government shut down. having had the same conversation every day. And without a solution in sight, we bring him in now. Bloomberg Congressional reporter live from Capitol Hill. Erik, is there any chance at lawmakers saving this, or the cliff is the cliff and we're going over it?
Right. I don't think we'll see Obamacare subsidies extended before the end of the year. There's still a small chance I'm monitoring that something comes together in January. What we're watching is House moderate Republicans who are trying to get this amendment vote on their sort of bipartisan plan to extend Obamacare either 1 or 2 years, depending on the version that we see. We have yet to see that version. If they don't get a vote, if that vote fails, there's still the option for them to sign on to a discharge petition. This is a way of forcing a vote on the House floor put forward by Democrats. Democrats only need a handful of signatories, and then that can start a clock where we come back in January and see a vote. Now, as you noticed already, people will have seen their Obamacare premiums go up, but there's a chance that, that same bill could extend the open enrollment period. You'll still see people drop off or lose their insurance, but there is potentially a chance. But, the Senate is going to look to go out of town on Thursday. This runway is already greased for them to leave. And as you mentioned, the national defense bill is on the docket. So I just don't see this. My bet would be that, it's a pretty sure bet it will not be extended before the end of the year.
Now, this is what the end of the year looks like on Capitol Hill. Erik, not a lot, it seems, will get done here, but I'm compelled by what you just mentioned, because if this Republican plan in the House does not pass with the support of moderates, will the moderates then turn to that Democratic discharge petition? It's got 214 signatures on it, Erik. It wouldn't take that many to force this to the floor.
That's right. And the discharge petitions have really gained steam. This is a very rare, it's an affront to the authority of the Speaker, but we've seen them really gain steam here in the House in the last couple of months. That's what, forced this vote basically on the Epstein file release. We're facing a Friday deadline to see all of those Epstein files. There are other discharge petitions active on stopping members from trading stocks, for example. One actually succeeded in protecting federal worker union rights, and the House passed that bill on an overwhelming basis. It's just kind of sitting in the Senate, but still is a very symbolic move and affront to the Speaker. So there's a chance that that could actually happen, and Democrats would be able to get a vote on that in January.
Just curious about war powers, Erik, while you're with us. We talked last week with Jim McGovern. He's got a War Powers Act that's supposed to ripen this week. Now we see Senator Ruben Gallego offering a war powers resolution, all with their eyes, of course, on what's happening in Venezuela. Are any of these going anywhere?
I think the real deciding factor there will be if we get a land invasion. Trump has many times said that there's going to be land activity in Venezuela, potentially even Colombia or somewhere. If that happens, Schumer is ready to launch a real, effort to do a war powers raiding in the president. I think it would get some support. I think there's not a lot of appetite in either party for a land war in Venezuela. We'll see if the president can make his case. But interestingly, the NDAA, the National Defense Bill, does repeal authorizations that have lingered since the Iraq War and before that have been used to justify these sorts of activities. So that would sort of create an interesting legal limbo for anyone going in. The NDAA is a very interesting bill. There's an outbound investment provision in there that really affects U.S. investors trying to invest into China. It expands to Russia, other countries. When this bill, which is likely going to pass before the end of the week in the Senate, comes into law, there's a different landscape for those investors, as well as some changes to pharmaceutical supply chains. The Biosecure Act is in there. So this is something that, normally just think about it in terms of defense contractors, but this will be an important bill for the wider investor community if this gets into law.
Well, that's really important, and it never gets enough coverage. Erik, Friday's it, right? We're going to hear a lot of references to fly-out day and jet fumes this week. Everybody's gone on Friday no matter what happens with these bills.
That's what I'm thinking. The House added Friday as a vote day when they were getting under heavy criticism from their own party for keeping away from D.C. for 8 weeks. They may even leave before Friday if things are looking too tumultuous for the Speaker.
I'm so not surprised to hear that. Erik, thank you. I hope that means your weekend starts earlier, too. Erik Wassen, I don't, by the way, think it works that way. Bloomberg Congressional reporter. There's your live update. So we're starting this week. We got 5 days without exactly knowing what in the world is going to happen. Yet everyone seems to know that everything we just talked about is going to fail. So 2025 in Washington. By the way, that NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, has $400 million in it, earmarked for Ukraine. No one's talking about that either. But there would be some at least tacit support, whether that comes in the form of intelligence or military support coming from the United States, even with this passing here today and peace talks underway that we want to talk about now with Heather Conley. This was day 2 in Berlin, right? President Zelensky at the table, Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, trying to advance the ball here on what the president would love to call a Christmas peace deal. Not a lot of people think that will happen, but there has been a bit more optimism surrounding this most recent stage than we have heard recently. Heather Conley is non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, former deputy assistant secretary of state for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. Heather, it's great to have you back as part of our conversation on Bloomberg. Pretty remarkable headlines coming out of Berlin. Now, President Zelensky says, I'll give up on the quest to join NATO as well. We haven't seen really a single concession by the Russian sides. Would something like this, though, get the gears turning toward peace? Well,
Joe, I think you're right that we are seeing real progress coming out of these 2 days of talks in Berlin. There have been Ukrainian concessions, but I would put them in quotation marks.
Okay.
NATO membership was something that was always going to be a very long-term prospect. Sure. But what the Ukrainians are asking for is NATO-like Article 5 security guarantees. And that is one of the main sticking points for these conversations. What security guarantees can the United States and Europe give to Ukraine when Russia violates this peace deal? That and, of course, territorial concessions. Will the Ukrainians approve of turning over land that they currently defend in the Donbass? Those are really the 2 key sticking points.
And I guess 3 when you add NATO. So let's pick 100%. Through them. To your point, NATO is an ambition. That was not something that was about to happen and wouldn't be unlocked by a peace deal. So let's focus on the other 2 here, because I guess Zelensky is kind of warming up to the idea of maybe joining the EU, if not NATO. But without NATO, there's still an Article 5 type of guarantee here that's being talked about. And that came as well from Witkoff and Kushner, right? This wasn't just Zelensky putting this forward. The United States suggested this without the involvement of Europe, but it would require European troops, would it not?
Yeah, I mean, I think there certainly the U.S. would have to have those security guarantees. There's some rumors coming out of Berlin that the administration would submit these security guarantees for Senate ratification, almost like a treaty, like we would do to amend the NATO treaty. That would be important. But yes, Europe has to be part of this as well. And the Ukrainians have negotiated bilateral security guarantees with those countries. But the question, Joe, is when they're tested, will we apply military power against Russian forces, again, when they violate this peace deal? And that is the question mark.
I think that was framed as in the event of a sustained attack in the initial language we saw. So a cruise missile into an apartment building wouldn't qualify. Right.
But again, the sustainment may be through hybrid activities, meaning that they would seize the territory. It wouldn't be through military means, but they would do it through hybrid warfare. That wouldn't trigger it. So huge question marks.
All right. Well, let's talk territory then, because you freeze the lines on the Donbass. And I think Zelensky suggested maybe he puts this to a vote, right? Let's actually have the people who live there vote on this. I'm guessing that based on his history of behavior, Vladimir Putin wouldn't care either way, would he?
Yeah, this is where I actually do think Vladimir Putin does care, because it's now in the Russian constitution that these 4 Ukrainian territories are Russian.
So that's the motherland, he says.
Exactly. Yeah? Okay. And this is the restoration of Russia's historic lands. But this would be Ukraine giving up territory it currently defends, and this territory is part of its so-called fortress belt, which is its defensive line. So without those lines, Ukraine is going to have a very hard time being able to reinforce its military across its border. So in some ways, it would render it in part defenseless.
This is why we were talking about a potential demilitarized zone in that area, right? Is that a more realistic approach?
Well, again, it gets back to the who protects this demilitarized zone. Again, it's important to remember we've been to this movie before when the first annexation and incursion into Ukraine, there was an OSC monitoring force, and that ceasefire was violated repeatedly, even though it was monitored. And this is where, again, Russian hybrid tactics really were trying to change the status on the ground.
Really interesting. So we've talked through some of the particulars that are at the table here, and I guess they have concluded. This was a 3-hour session today in Berlin. It was about 5 hours yesterday. I'm assuming everybody flies home now, and President Zelensky sure would love an invitation here to the U.S., but we've still left the Europeans out of this conversation as well. The Russians haven't given much in the way of encouraging remarks about this. So Are we just spinning our wheels until everyone's in the same room?
Well, I think the Europeans are feeling better. The fact that these conversations were held in Berlin and that they actually were at the table. Now, the incredible visual is the U.S. is on one side, Europe and the Ukrainians on the other side, that we are negotiating with our European partners. I think, exactly. I think this plan now, whatever comes out, is going to have to be briefed to the Russians. I assume that Special Envoy Witkoff has already been keeping the Russians pretty well informed. They may not accept some of these changes, and you're absolutely right. If the Ukrainian government does decide to make some territorial concessions, have to change their constitution to remove NATO, you're talking about a referendum, you're talking about an election that President Zelensky did just say over the weekend that potentially could happen in 60 to 90 days after a peace deal. So it could be a lot of changes, or we could be quite stalled.
Is there a single Russian concession that you could see coming out of this?
No.
Well, my God, how do you find peace in that world?
So you cave, you capitulate to the Russian position, and
brutal.
It's absolutely brutal.
But is that sustainable if you're framed as capitulating?
It's not sustainable. It's not sustainable.
You're ready to fight another war.
In Ukraine, it's not sustainable. In Europe, it's not sustainable for the United States and our security interests. This is why the British head of MI6 just came out with a devastating speech saying we're already in war with Russia. The hybrid activity, NATO Secretary General Rutte last week said in 5 years there will be war. So you hear us preparing for this, yet we're talking about appeasing the aggressor. It is extraordinary. It does feel like 1938.
Well, that's a heck of a statement here. Will it feel like 1938 for the next 3 years and 2 months? To what extent is the administration keeping this Russian dream alive?
So it is...
Or maybe a Putin dream is a better way to put it.
Well, again, this is where last week's national security strategy did not articulate who our adversaries are. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. It spoke about a focus on the Western Hemisphere. It talked about securing economic and strategic stability. We are closing our eyes to this. And if, in fact, the United States provides security guarantees, we are inserting ourselves in this. So this is a moment for clarity of knowing who the aggressor is, who is challenging the United States and our European partners, and preparing for potential conflict.
Just a minute to go here, Heather. What is China learning as it watches the way we work with Ukraine, keeping Taiwan in mind?
I think it is learning that we will appease for some sort of magical economic stability, that you have, you don't have that stability. It is emboldening those who believe that they can snatch territory, and that if there's economic disturbance, that they will negotiate and get that stability. It's a terrible message to America's adversaries.
Boy, it really is. Is that because you think that Donald Trump is more interested in normalizing economic ties with Russia? When you talk about that economic stability, imaginary or not, how does he find it here?
Well, I think what is elusive is that there is no momentary deal that will stick. And I think this is what the White House is learning with all the deals that have been negotiated. They're starting to fall apart because it's not just that moment. It's creating the structure to deter aggression, to be strong, and send a clear message to our adversaries. We are strong with our allies and partners. Don't violate international law.
This is a very delicate moment that we're in, Heather. I'm really glad that you could join us to talk about it once again. That's Heather Conley from the American Enterprise Institute. Last time she joined us, we said we need to get her back, and this is why. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. We'll keep the beat on the effort to find peace in Ukraine as we wait for a readout from the White House. We've not seen one on an official piece of paper or on Truth Social, and that might emerge a bit later today. Republican Congressman Troy Downing of Montana joins us next as we turn back to healthcare on Bloomberg. Here on the Monday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, we thank you for joining us here with big questions about what could be accomplished this week on Capitol Hill with 5 working days left. Yeah, we're almost there at the end of the year. In fact, it's just a couple of weeks until the enhanced Obamacare subsidies from the COVID era are going to expire. And we've been talking about this on the daily. It looks like there could be some really interesting maneuvers on Capitol Hill directed toward your health care in the coming days, whether it's through discharge petition or otherwise. We're going to get down to some voting. As we mentioned, the NDAA in the Senate, that was likely just in the next couple of days, and that'll pass. That's the must-pass bill. Healthcare is another matter. And glad to be joined by Troy Downing, the Republican congressman from Montana. 2nd District is with us here in studio today on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's kind of you to come by, and I appreciate it very much because there are a lot of questions about what's going to get done here. And you probably have some of these questions, too.
Yeah.
It could be the Republican-led bill that was released late last week will get a vote. There also could be other votes, though, in terms of a discharge petition. There was another extension to the ACA that at one point was promised to bring to a floor vote. Now it might not happen. Do you have a clear view of what this week will look like?
Well, here's the thing with those discharge positions. Actually, let's just take a step back on these enhanced premium tax credits, because a lot of the rhetoric that we see on social media from headlines from people pushing back is we have to do something or premiums are going up. Premiums already went up. The open enrollment period is over. I mean, that's already baked in. For those who don't understand how this works, the payers, the insurance companies, they file with their states months before the open enrollment period. It gets approved. It gets filed with CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and then comes the open enrollment period where you pick your policy for the next policy year starting January 1st. That's over. And so this whole argument about if we don't do something by the 31st, then suddenly premiums are going to go up. Well, I'm going to tell you, if the enhanced premium tax credits, if the Obamacare tax credits expire, rates have gone up. If they get extended, rates have gone up. It's the same thing no matter what. But here's the thing that folks aren't talking about is the chaos.
So they wouldn't, just to be clear before you go on, they wouldn't come back down through some sort of retroactive language and legislation?
Well, so let's just think about what would have to happen mechanically.
Yes.
Is first of all, you'd have to have the payers, the insurance companies, refile their rates.
Okay, yes,
so let's say we get into that, by February. So those get reviewed, those get filed. So then you have to have another open enrollment period. And that's going to create confusion in the marketplace because people who pay a portion of their small group or large group through their employers are going to think, well, hey, I'm going to get a discount too. But no, this only affects the individual market, so it's a small percentage. So then you have to have an open enrollment period. Let's say that's March or April or whenever they can do that. So then do you make it ex post facto going back to January 1st? Do you have it going forward? But it creates confusion in the market, and I'm not exactly sure how we would deal with that mechanically. But then let's look at what happens if we just extend the tax credits. Let's say we extend them for 2 years. Well, then everybody refiles next spring. We have another open enrollment period, November, December, and that goes into the 2027 policy year, which will probably still be a little bit of an increase, because here's one thing that the Republicans and the Democrats all agree on right now is ACA, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare has been a complete failure, and rates have gone up independent of these tax credits. They're going up no matter what because the cost of health care has gone up. And what's happened is the cost of health care goes up. Of course, the cost of health insurance goes up.
Yes.
And when that happens, people start coming off and they find alternatives. Either they go uninsured or they find an alternative like a health sharing ministry or some other thing. And it's not the healthy people. I mean, it's not the sick people that come off, it's the healthy people. So the younger, healthier people come off, and that creates this phenomenon called adverse selection. So then you've concentrated the risk, losses go higher, and the next premium year, premiums go higher. And that creates this whole cycle.
Is brutal. And our audience should know you were state auditor overseeing this very matter in the state of Montana. So you have a unique understanding of all of this stuff. KFF says the expiration would more than double on average what people are paying annually. President Trump would say, keying off of what you just described, then so send people the money instead of the insurance companies. But don't people lose power by having essentially an individual barter with this massive insurance company? How does that keep premiums down?
First of all, let's just correct the record on one thing. The actual rates that have gone up in just the individual market, so just a small fraction of the overall market, on average, in Montana, on average, is about 22%. And the enhanced premium tax credit, the Obamacare tax bracket, that's single digits of that. So it does have an effect, but the rates are going up with or without that. So first of all, just make sure that the people understand that. And then in terms of the healthcare savings accounts that the president's talking about, personally, I think there's meat on the bone there.
But they're not going to be in this bill?
They're not going to be in this bill, unfortunately, but this is something that we need to...
That's like the Bill Cassidy plan is something that you would warm up to.
Well, I think there's meat on the bone here for a very simple reason. One of the issues that we have is we've created so much distance between the doctor and the patient.
Yeah.
There's so much in between there. And what an HSA does is you've got a finite amount of money for paying for your out-of-pocket expenses, for your medical expenses, and it can only be used for that. And so now you're saying, I've got $5,000 in there, or however much that money is, and you're talking to your doctor, and you're saying, well, how much does this test cost?
Yeah.
Well, do I really need that? Or the other thing is right now nobody is incentivized to look for actual pricing. So if I talk to Dr. 1 and I say this is going to cost $500, and Dr. 2 says $1,000, it starts to put that in there, because the problem right now is somebody else is going to pay for it. So there's no incentive for somebody to look at what the actual cost they're being charged is, because you know that your insurance company is going to pay it.
And that would be the individual doing that.
So
shopping,
the HSA,
right?
with the HSA, it puts more power. If we start to expand that, it puts more power into the patient in having that conversation with their doctor and actually asking, because now it affects them directly, asking what the prices are, what the tests should be, what the expenses of the. So it brings that in. I just think about, when I was growing up, lived in a single income family, worked in a grocery store, so not a family of high means. And when I'd come out of the doctor, my mom would go up to the front desk and she'd get out her checkbook and write a check.
Yeah.
And that's how we did it, because there was that doctor-patient relationship. And I think we've come so far away from that and put so much money into the system that we've seen the underlying care, cost of health care going up. Economics 101, you put money into a system, things get more expensive, and we've seen that, and that creates that vicious cycle that we talked about with adverse selection.
Well, and a conversation like this gives somebody a popsicle headache, because it's complicated stuff.
It is.
They're trying to figure out, well, what part of this policy is going to help me?
And that's what makes it hard politically, because it is hard to explain.
Because you have to communicate this stuff.
It is hard to explain.
So let's say, all right, so the messaging system breaks down here, and we're looking at a government funding deadline at the end of January.
Right.
I'm not even going to ask you. Are you worried?
I think, when we had the shutdown, that 43-day shutdown, it was horrible. Nobody wins. Everybody, well, which side won? Did the Republicans win?
We have short memories, Congressman.
Nobody wins in a shutdown. But here's one thing that I will say is at least on my side of the aisle, the Republican conference really stuck together and said, okay, we're not going to negotiate this craziness. They're bringing in all these red herring when this is really a simple, short-term extension of current policy so that we get through the appropriations process.
Is the scar tissue from that experience enough to keep us from doing it again?
I can be hopeful. I really think it is. I think that's going to come into play when I know that the resolve on the Republican side is pretty strong, and I think that the Democrats learn that is not a winning prospect. So I'm hoping that calmer heads come to the table and prevail, and we start to get more of these appropriations bills through. So obviously we just had the National Defense Authorization Act, so that's going to the Senate. Hopefully that moves through. So we're slowly ticking away at these. We'd all be happier if it went faster, but the frustrating thing for me is that when these appropriations bills come out of committee, you got the four corners. They start out bipartisan. It came out of committee with the ranking member and the chair, both the Senate and the House side. So you've already got a bipartisan spending bill. And it's just frustrating that we can't all rally around this, get back, as Speaker Johnson says, the muscle memory of actually appropriating and going through that process rather than continuing CRs and omnibus spending bills. And I think there's a huge desire to get back to that, and I am so hopeful that we can get back to that. And it may not be this cycle, maybe the next cycle, but soon, because the American people want that. The people that voted us into office want that. We all want to get back to that and get back to actually doing our job of regular order.
Well, when we get to regular order, come back. We'll do a special together, Congressman.
Exactly. I would love that.
You back with us. It's Troy Downing, Republican from Montana, on a very important week here on Capitol Hill. We thank you, Congressman, for the insights as we assemble our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino join us now with their insights on everything we just talked about. And it's hard to get away from the healthcare story. So we'll start right there. Rick, Republicans have a very interesting looking schedule here in the House over the course of the week. Will we see voting on all the various forms of legislation that we just talked about? And will this come down to a discharge petition?
Well, if it comes down to a discharge petition, it just depends upon which discharge petition they're going to carry, because all of these are slightly different, including the House bills. I mean, part of the biggest problem we have is the Republican Party has not focused on a solution set that they can get on board with as a party. And so we have 4 different bills right now in the House of Representatives to fix the system, right? And yet none of them are a comprehensive fix. And I think the congressman was right saying, look, there are huge advantages to HSAs, but they don't really fix the whole problem. And so are you going to tinker with it and try to make it a little bit better while at the same time tightening your belt on things like these subsidies? I'd be surprised, because Congress by nature doesn't like to tighten its belt. It is a spending machine. It hasn't gotten smaller. Government has gotten bigger with this Republican Congress. And so the fact that they're going to pass something that actually makes it smaller would be, I think, great, but unlikely.
So we're going over the cliff, Jeannie, is what it sounds like. And based on what the congressman just said, don't wait around for a life raft. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I believe he said we've already gone off the cliff. It's too late. There's nothing that can be done. The costs are going up. You know, there's so many stunning things about this, but I would say one of the most stunning things is that affordability is the biggest issue domestically right now. Donald Trump is talking over the weekend in an interview where he's saying he may lose, Republicans may lose the House next year, and yet they are doing nothing about health care because the president would have to lead that charge, and he's absolutely AWOL.
Incredible stuff. Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis. We're like Thelma and Louise. We're going off the cliff together. We'll have more with our panel coming up in the late edition of Balance of Power. That starts at 5 p.m. Eastern. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. Stay with us. It's only here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We've spent the balance of the program talking about uncertainty around policy here in Washington. And, well, that's not new if you ever join us here on Bloomberg TV and radio around this time every day. But we are finally going to start filling in the blanks when it comes to economic data here. Not a lot of earnings to look at. We've got a couple of big ones like FedEx and Nike, Micron a couple of days from now, but big for economic news. And we're going to start catching up on some of the missing data with jobs reports. We've got retail and inflation all on the calendar this week. And then, of course, well, there's Santa Claus. Where's the end of year melt up here? Did Charlie miss something? I heard about a lot of things going down. So we thought we would spend a little bit of time with Kristine Aquino to get a sense of what to expect over the course of this week, because by the time we get to Friday, yeah, there are going to be some trading days left. But the smart people like Kristine are going to be gone. They're on their way to grandma's house, and it's going to be light trading, super light, quiet, low volume days. Kristine, it's great to see you. She's the managing editor for Bloomberg Markets Live blog. And we've got a lot of news to digest in the days ahead, don't we?
Absolutely, Joe. And let me just correct you and say that I will be around for the rest of the year, barring the holidays.
Wait a minute. Don't they know who you are? All right, that means you're coming on the show next week, and I'll meet you then.
But yes, absolutely. I think how you described it is very much on point, Joe. I mean, there's a lot of questions still over what the state of the U.S. economy is, given that a lot of investors were really in the dark during the dearth of data over the government shutdown. And as you say, they're now starting to fill in the blanks, right? And I think, you know, what we're seeing this week is just a little bit of a pause from the recent moves that we've seen, which actually has turned more optimistic for both the stock and bond market as of late. But now we're kind of seeing those gains pause because, yeah, investors are wanting to confirm what we have seen in alternative data sources for the labor market, for instance, right? Is that softness actually going to be backed by the official non-farm payrolls data that we're going to get tomorrow, in addition to all the other tier one data points this week? And so it makes a lot of sense for investors to kind of just take a little bit of money off the table, maybe, you know, sell the rumor, buy the fact once that we get that confirmation, or negate that some of the alternative data sources. But yeah, you do seem to have a lot of investors staying the sidelines, at least for this week.
Wow. So are we robbed the whole end of year melt up that so many analysts were predicting, all the year end factors that come into play with portfolio managers trying to dump their losers and catch up with the winners. Did we front load all the good stuff this year?
Well, Joe, I mean, I think if you zoom out to, say, for instance, the year-to-date chart of the S&P 500, I mean, that is still massively up this year, especially from the lows in early April. And, you know, we're still a whisker away from that new record high that we hit in late October. And so I think stepping back, it's still a positive equities year, certainly a positive year for fixed income as well. And so I think, you know, maybe that melt up may have already been underway, or we're in the midst of it. But it seems like, you know, a lot of that, as you say, may have been front loaded early in December. I started hearing about the Santa rally the day after Thanksgiving. And so, you know, I think maybe investors got a little overexcited, but I think overall, investors are probably comfortably booking year-to-date gains for both equities and the fixed income market here.
Well, you know, we're hard to please around here, and we get bored, Kristine. The last couple of weeks, though, have been kind of tough with the unwinding of the AI trade. But we do have to remind everybody that there are actually a lot of stocks going up, right? That's why the S&P 500 is sitting right where it is. We're going to be joined by John Bozzella in just a moment. GM, all-time high today. That's a pretty good example.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. And yeah, I'm just looking at the groups that are leading the S&P 500 day. Very interesting, right? So there's a lot of cars, cable, hotels, tobacco, and, you know, you have semiconductor equipment there as well. And so I think this is kind of testament to, yes, we're taking a little bit of a breather in terms of index gains today. But when you look at kind of the movers, the leaders and losers there, it is very encouraging to see that there's more breadth in this market. And I think that's why investors aren't necessarily, you know, panicking just because we're down today. I think they're taking heart in the fact that, okay, like the gains seem to be more evenly distributed beyond the tech sector. And that speaks to a little bit of a alleviation of the worries over the AI bubble.
Well, let's get some of this data under our belt, some of these earnings that I mentioned. We'll see where we are by the end of the week. Kristine, we're going to compare notes with you. You're locked in now. She's going nowhere for the holidays. Like me, Kristine Aquino. Thank you so much. Managing editor, Bloomberg Markets Live blog. Charlie will have more on the Monday trade coming up at 2 p.m. I mentioned shares of GM. That has been a hot stock recently. Ford's been doing pretty good. They all have been, thanks in part to this program rolled out by the president that we talked about back. It was the 2nd of December, I believe. The administration undoing Biden-era fuel efficiency standards, which it blames on driving up the cost of new cars. We carried that event when the president announced it earlier this month. Listen.
My administration has taken historic action to lower costs for American consumers, protect American auto jobs, and make buying a car much more affordable for countless American families and also safer. Now, under the new rules being issued by Secretary Duffy, the Department of Transportation will rescind the Biden fuel economy prices. In other words, we're bringing automobiles back and the manufacturing of automobiles back into this country.
Remembering they topped out, right? $50,000. The price of a car in this country hit $50,000 on average for the first time ever in September, which means no car for a lot of Americans. What does this mean for the companies as well, though? Remember, we talked last time, I believe we talked to John Bozzella. It was about the many changes that they were being asked to make because of the tariff regime and the complications when it comes to manufacturing cross-border with Mexico and Canada. Now another change, but this one seems to be going over a little easier. John Bozzella is president and CEO of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, where the story changes every day lately, John. It's great to see you. Welcome back.
Great to be back, Joe. Thank you.
The car makers were in the room for this one, though, which reminds us that they were pretty happy with this news. Is it just as easy to downscale when it comes to emissions like this as it was to put all of these changes in effect to begin with?
Yeah, you know, that's a really good question you're asking. It's a great place to start because what manufacturers want more than anything else is a degree of certainty and clarity about what the rules are going to be. This is a long lead time, high asset business, right? So these companies are planning model years out, 28, 29, model year 2030. And so you got to have consistency, clarity, and some degree, you know, of stability here. But what we did see, and you know, you saw this in the clip you just played of the president, this is really kind of a return to the roots of what this corporate average fuel economy program really was. It was established in the 1970s to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. Its focus has always been on increasing the efficiency of gasoline-powered cars and trucks. And so that's where the Trump administration is starting with this program, and it's a good place to start.
It's interesting. It was inspired by dependency on oil from other nations, not climate, which it is more typically associated with.
Yeah, it's exactly right. Now, it really isn't a climate measure. There are other regulations that are associated with climate and auto emissions related to the climate. But this is really about fuel economy, but also, here's a word Congress uses, economic practicability. What you and I would say is affordability. So that's what the Trump administration is leaning in on here.
Sure.
They're saying, look, the days when you could make assumptions of very, very high levels of electric vehicles being sold into the fleet and then setting CAFE standards based on that idea that there are going to be a lot of electric vehicles in the fleet, that's illegal. Congress said you can't do that. And so the Trump administration is just trying to reset the baseline, follow the law, and go forward.
So I guess the two big questions that we all have are, number one, how will this impact the price of a car? Do we see that number come back below $50,000? In what period of time? But also, what types of changes, what kind of retooling do these automakers need to do to crank out what I guess is a slightly more old-fashioned kind of car?
Yeah, I think we should be careful with the idea of old-fashioned.
Okay,
right?
Sure.
And I'll tell you why. I think really the previous standards were really overly ambitious, to say the least. They were unachievable. The assumptions that went into them, the levels of electric vehicles that we thought the market would demand, the amount of charging infrastructure that people felt would be available to customers, it just isn't there. And so having a reset and a reevaluation of these programs makes sense. Now, that doesn't mean that there will not be electric vehicles in the future, or plug-in hybrids or hybrid technology.
Do you make an ICE car differently, though, because of this change?
There's always improvements, even in ICE technologies. But what I think you'll see is much more hybridization across the fleet, right? And so today, if you look at the market, the numbers of gasoline-powered vehicles are going down and the numbers of hybrid vehicles are going up. And so I think you'll see more of that.
You were in, I think, Japan with President Trump, and I know you're a world traveler, because he was pointing to Japan when it came to the tiny cars post. And I want you to explain it to me. This was, I believe, the 5th of December. I've just approved tiny cars, he says, to be built in America. These cars of the very near future are inexpensive, safe, fuel efficient, and quite simply amazing. He said, start building them now. Are we talking about like the Pope Mobile? This is the Fiat. What did he see in Japan with you?
Here's what he saw, and I saw them too, and I was there at around the same time. What he saw was these very, very small cars that are really built to get down these narrow alley type roads.
Are we not allowed to make them here, or we just don't?
I think we are. I think it's a matter of what customers demand. And if customers demand small cars, you'll see small cars. We certainly saw Stellantis produce the Fiat 500 and sell it in the United States. We've seen other small cars. It really comes down, in my view, to what the customer demands. Now, is the Department of Transportation right to look at whether there are regulatory barriers? Yes, but let's be very clear. No one is ever going to sacrifice safety to bring vehicles into the marketplace. And so as long as safety's first and foremost, if customers want them, they'll get them.
Does that help to bring the average cost of a car down?
It could.
These would be much cheaper, right?
It could. By the way, when you look at that $50,000, so when we hit that target, we also were experiencing a very high level of electric vehicle sales. Right. This was at the very end of the tax credit.
So that will naturally come down.
Yes. Right. So you're going to see, if you're already seeing the average transaction price down a little bit as relatively more expensive EVs are sold in smaller volumes. But I do think this affordability question is something we have to continue to look at. And I do think there's a role for policy to support affordability as well.
There's also the matter of culture, right? American culture. I keep hearing this, and you go outside right now, we'll look up and down I Street. Americans like big cars. I mean, how do we rationalize the tiny car thing with what I see every time I get on the road?
I think you're exactly right about that. This is a market that values large cars. It's also a market that values what a car marketing person might call a richer mix, higher trim levels, more technology, more stuff in the vehicle. That's just what consumers demand in this market. I think, though, that when you get a little bit more of the deregulatory actions in place, you will see some affordability, but there are larger questions related to purchasing, questions related to supply chain, questions related to tariffs. It isn't simple. It's overly simplistic to suggest that it just needs a little bit of deregulation and then the vehicles become more affordable. It's more complex.
Your industry has become so complicated. There's no doubt about it. How many people pick the car based on the infotainment system? You've got to have a percentage on that, right? It's got to be a huge. It's like buying the wine based on the label. It happens every day, right?
You know, I think it does, but I'll tell you what. In China, it happens more in China than it happens here.
They want the bells and the whistles.
Well, they want the
John Bozzella. I'm sorry, we're out of time.
Fantastic, Joe.
The Alliance for Automotive Innovation. He's the expert. I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Bloomberg.